All right, welcome back, everybody. Second night of the third annual Fordham Law Film Festival, and we have, as we've announced earlier on, this astonishingly distinguished post-screening guests. We have, of course, Nadine Strawson, who I mentioned, and we're going to have to acknowledge yet again. After 3 hours ago, not more than 3 hours ago, that was her. She officially handed over the gavel after 18 years as the president of the American Civil Liberties Union. And I think this is sort of a fateful new beginning for her. You've heard of Siskel Ebert. It's now Strawson and Abrams. They're going to have their own little PBS thing, and they're sort of auditioning here. This is a backers audition for Strawson and Abrams.
We would never give anything an X rating, though.
No, that's true. They would never give it an X rating. And you know, Floyd Abrams, who I mentioned earlier, is sort of Barnum. No one is clearly the most distinguished First Amendment lawyer in America. But he is also, as of, let's see, middle of December, you'll be also a distinguished American actor. Can you tell us about this? Floyd is virtually starring in a feature film.
There's a movie coming out this December called Nothing But the Truth with Kate Beckinsale and Matt Dillon and Alan Alda and other serious actors, which is a story of a reporter who refuses to reveal her sources and goes before a judge, moi, and is jailed very quickly. But lots more happens. I think it's a good movie.
And who plays the real twat?
Alan Alda.
Now, did you tell Alda what to do?
You should see, by the way, you know, when you argue a case in the Supreme Court and, you know, they're all over you and questioning and this and that, the scene in which Alan Alda played the role, he had in back, or right over the Chief Justice's head, the words that he was reading. And there were no questions. What a joy it was.
So for next year's film festival.
Oh yes, we're going to have Alan Alda and Floyd Abrams.
No, it's nothing but the truth, and I hope it's good.
And you played a judge. Were you hard on the parties?
I was very tough.
Right.
Yeah. For a while anyway, but I don't want to give anything away. But I think I know it's interesting, and the acting of a lot of the serious people, Alda and Vera Farmiga, wonderful actress, Kate Beckinsale. It was done very seriously by people, a number of whom worked for Scale. I now know that language. I almost joined the Screen Actors Guild.
Can't believe they let you play the judge without it.
Well, the Taft-Hartley law, for you law students here, says that you don't have to join a union if it's your first movie and you work for less than 30 days. And I worked for considerably less than 30 days.
So speaking of dramatic actors, in about, let's see, what time is it? About 2 hours from now, one of America's newest finest actors, Sarah Palin, will be on Saturday Night Live.
Oh, we have to finish in time to see that.
She has graciously agreed to be involved in the third annual Fordham Law Film Festival. Sarah's outside because she doesn't like this movie. Why not? Why wouldn't Sarah Palin like this movie? And tell us why you do like this movie. Let's start with Nadine.
Well, you know, we were talking right before Thane opened it up to the audience that even when this movie was made in 1974, this was still pretty out there. I think movie audiences were not used to hearing this kind of language. And I read that the audiences that were in the show, in the clubs, were actually just people who were picked off the street, which is kind of interesting. If you know that, you could see the shocked reaction, the kind of titillation that they were. It was just a new experience to hear this kind of language anywhere, and therefore I assume that was true for many of the people in the audience. You know, how can I not love the film as a First Amendment absolutist? I mean, it's a very upsetting film. The idea that somebody could actually be convicted and sentenced to prison And I'm from the Midwest, so I don't mean this to sound like, some geographicist remark, but in New York, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, and San Francisco, if you can be convicted for saying these words in those places, then obviously there was no safe place, at least in this country. And it's, and the words, by the way, I think San Francisco, they showed what might be considered the most out there, but in New York, the word that he was convicted for was fucking. In Los Angeles, it was...
Nadine, this is a Jesuit school.
I'm not going to say what came to my mind when I heard
Say
that.
fucking. That's what Lenny took. Come on, take this on the word.
But I started with the most shocking ones. To me, it's most shocking that in Los Angeles and Chicago, the words that he was convicted for were tits and schmuck. And by the way, I don't exactly know what schmuck means. Does it mean something?
Yes, it does, but you have to translate.
But I don't think he meant it in that way.
Yeah.
Well, that's one of the interesting things about this, the whole thing. And we have a case in the Supreme Court, and it's going to be argued, when, November?
Mm-hmm. And some of my students are going.
Oh, I was trying to think as I was watching it, what sort of case now could involve anything like the sort of thing we've seen tonight. And about the only one I can imagine is one involving television.
Over-the-air television.
Over-the-air, non-cable television.
Because in a club, this would be routine.
In a club, it would be protected speech.
Right.
And on cable, it would be protected speech.
And on the internet.
And on the internet, it would be protected speech. And on over-the-air network television, when Bono got an award and said, this is fucking great, $350,000 fine per station that shows it around the country, not network even. And a few other cases, the wardrobe malfunction, you remember, during the Super Bowl, which the country barely recovered from even now. But that's the only context in which I can
think of another context, but which is, the other aspect of his shocking language, and I'm just going to say, the N-word. Okay, he said nigger, he said kike, he said all those horrible things that we're finding on college campuses are violating hate speech codes. And even if the context is purely educational, which is why you heard that bit of self-censorship, there have been so many cases where professors and students have been treated as engaging in racial harassment or sexual harassment, even if they're trying to make a serious anti-racist, anti-sexist comment by using that language. So the sting hasn't gone out of those words either.
I was actually troubled by that scene because, it was clearly a disturbing scene. But the implication of the scene is, if we just say these words enough, we will then have disarmed them. And they would become so routine that they would have no power over the person who hears it. But let me just say, if I were Sarah Palin, I would say, well, why is that so? Why is it that a person should be exposed to that, even if they hear the word nigger 1,000 times, on the 1,001th time, that one time, it could be over-disturbing to them, incredibly offensive. And why do we have the assumption, the presumption is that, well, if you say it commonly, it'll have no longer a power over us. And that was the implication of that scene. Sure. But I'm quite sure that many Polacks and Guidos and Kikes and niggers would say, no, you know what? You could say it as many times as you want. It'll bother me.
Look, he's taking the easy way out. I mean, intellectually, it's very easy to say, oh, let's just keep saying the word a lot.
Right.
And then it won't mean anything. I don't believe that.
And
that doesn't mean that we should ban the word, but the notion that in effect we can save the world by just using raw epithets so often that they will lose their force doesn't persuade me.
But it's equally false to say that we can save the world by banning epithets or by banning ideas, right? It's the actions that we should be militating against. And I think, look, you have no right not to be offended. And I think it's not because words are not powerful, and I certainly have been the victim of all kinds of hate speech, as you might imagine. So I'm not saying it because I think that words are powerless. It's the opposite. And the question is, what is the lesser of two evils? To allow government, whether it be in the form of a jury, whether it be in the form of a judge, we saw both examples, to decide which words are so offensive that they deserve being punished and being prohibited. It is just
No,
intolerable.
I think Nadine's absolutely right, and I think she phrased it very carefully and correct. It is two evils. It's not that bad words don't do some harm. It's that we make a cost-benefit analysis of how much harm we do in toto by allowing the government to get into the business of just deciding what words you can use. My point earlier is simply that it's too easy for Lenny Bruce to say, well, it won't hurt anymore if we use the words a lot. It will hurt, and we will still, I think, if we believe in the First Amendment, allow it.
Well, I think he has, I'm going to come to his defense. I think a bit of his point is that we can change the meaning, right? And Randy Kennedy, in his brilliant book, Nigger, really talks about that. And actually, this was an issue in the enforcement of some of these hate speech codes, because it all depended who said it to whom. So among African American guys, if they were friends with each other, they'd use it as a term of affection. So it's all
Carlin's
kinds.
point.
Yeah.
What's wrong with the word nigger? Black people call each other that all the time,
Yeah.
right? And yet, Sarah Palin would hate that.
Yeah. Can I say something on Floyd's point about the fact that the 7 dirty words are still banned on the over-the-air media? It's not just, the complaints that were drummed up by the Parents Television Council, but I think we really have to recognize that the overwhelming majority of members of Congress on both sides of the aisle voted to vastly increase the FCC's censorial power. To the best of my knowledge, not a single person who ran for president or is running for president who had the opportunity to vote on it voted against it. In other words, they all voted for it. The FCC, both Republicans and Democrats alike, are jumping over each other to continue censoring this stuff.
Floyd, so let me just get this straight, because I think I'm going to ask both of you to do something that you're familiar doing. You may not realize you need to do it at a law school. This is the Forum on Law, Culture, and Society. It's a public forum. That means a lot of people here actually are not lawyers, which is what we love about you. So explain briefly the First Amendment, right? We have the right to free speech, but it's not unlimited. Is that right? Just give us how does this work? I mean, why can't Lenny Bruce have done what he was doing? If, in fact, the First Amendment gives you the right to say what you want to say. You hear people invoke the First Amendment all the time. So how could he have been so persecuted if there's a First Amendment?
You're going to have to get beyond the language of the First Amendment itself, which says Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech or of the press. And just as Hugo Black used to always say, no law means no law. But the Supreme Court, including, ironically, those who would call themselves strict textualists, have read exceptions into that plain language of the First Amendment.
What they've said is that from the beginning of the country, from the very day of the founders, obscene language, let's put the definition aside, but obscene language was not what was meant by freedom of speech.
But and in fairness, the textual argument would be the First Amendment says the freedom of speech. And they say that refers to a particular idea.
Justice Scalia, who...
Good friend of ours.
We had a lovely evening one night, had great sport with us by emphasizing, as he does in his opinions too, the word that Nadine just quoted, that it doesn't say, Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. Oh no, Justice Scalia said, you're leaving out the most important word. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Well, he says, the means the way it was at the time of the Revolution. It doesn't have to mean that, by the way, but that's his starting point. The other word, if you want to be textual, is what do we mean even without the, what do we mean by freedom of speech? Do we mean all speech? I mean, there will always be some speech in some circumstance that we won't protect. We don't protect espionage. When espionage involves taking documents and, let's say, either orally repeating what they are when they're secret and deal with very secret plans for military activities and the like. No one has ever argued that that was protected. No one's ever argued that perjury can't be a crime, even though it's talking, if not speech. So we need some definition of what we're talking about. And I think the problem that Nadine and I have with some frequency is that once you say, well, of course freedom of speech doesn't mean this and that, the villains come in and say, well, all right, now we know freedom of speech isn't absolute. Let's just make it a rule of reason, which is in effect that if speech is really harmful to some social interest or other, why don't we let some serious level of constriction of it occur? And the fact is there are dozens of social interests
Right.
which speech runs into. Personal reputation, privacy, national security. I could go on.
But I think there's a big, there are some difficult issues, as I hope my students know, and those are the ones we debate. But I think there are some kinds of tangible harm. Some of the examples that Floyd gave, revealing state secrets or committing perjury is in a different category from the kind of harm that is said to be caused by the laws that Lenny Bruce was convicted for violating. And that is, hurting people's feelings. And, I'm not saying it's nothing, but you understand it's a different kind of harm in a free society, and certainly offending the prevailing morals or political views, and let us not forget religious views of the community, because there's a lot of reason to believe that Bruce was persecuted, especially in New York, because of the mockery he made of the Catholic Church. And the district attorney at the time was very tightly linked in, I'll say this here, it's very appropriate here at Fordham, with the then Archbishop of New York. And it was, they could use the law of obscenity as a way of getting at him, blasphemy. I think even our friend Justice Scalia would say you can't directly punish something for being sacrilegious anymore. And yet, when you have these vague laws, you give so much discretion to the enforcing authority to basically go after people they don't like, ideas they don't like, religiously upsetting ideas, political dissidents. And I think Bruce was, I was going to say crucified because, how ironic, as much because of his countercultural ideas.
I agree. But it's really striking to me, just to come back to the example I cited, it's just a year ago. I mean, we're not going back to the 60s or 70s now. Just a year ago, the FCC issued regulations using all these words. I mean, they try to deal with the problem Nadine just identified, the problem of vagueness, the problem of overbreath with the government cutting out too much speech by saying, all right, we'll tell you what you can't say. And we are telling you, and that they've said this, that the word fuck is always sexual. Always.
Regardless of context.
Regardless of how you use it, regardless of what the context is. And they say that because it wouldn't be obscene if it doesn't meet a legal test set forth by the Supreme Court, which is wholly sexual in nature.
And that's why.
So when you answer, when Bono says, I wasn't saying anything sexual, I was excited and I was happy.
And he used
and I
it
would
as
say
an
this
adjective,
is,
as an adverb,
this is
right?
fucking great. They say that's sexual by definition now, and that is the prevailing definition by the United States government when that word is used on television.
But why can't a community say we're going to set forth our own community standards? Sarah Palin style, small Wasilla towns say, look, you know what? We want to define. We're going
There
to.
are more people here than live in Wasilla.
Yeah.
And now that they can get cable TV, they probably love watching this stuff.
It's true. But what do you say to a community that says, look, we would like to protect our citizenry from what we deem to be both offensive and, as Lenny Bruce said, without social redeeming value. That we deem this, by definition, with all due respect to the lead singer of U2, no matter how you use the word fucking, no matter what context, we don't want to hear it.
And I would say, Sarah, I absolutely defend your freedom of choice. You have the right to decide not to watch this movie. You have the right to decide not to go to that comedy club. I will even defend your right to make basic decisions about your young children. Now, when they get a bit older, I might advise them of their own First Amendment rights. But when they're young, you have the right as their parent to decide what they will see and what they won't see. But you know what? Your next door neighbor has exactly the same right. And therefore, it is not your role as big sister, as mayor of this town, to deprive your next door neighbor of her own right to make her own decisions about what she will or will not see and what she will or will not let her own children see.
But that's good in a Wasila's, raunchy comedy club. I don't know if they have one, but if they did, Nook's there. But what about Floyd's, what he said earlier? You can't protect your kid who's watching the Super Bowl on public access, on regular commercial television, governed by the FCC, and all of a sudden, Janet Jackson's breast shows up. And all of a sudden, you think you're watching a halftime show,
And what was
a breast shows up, and you've got an 11-year-old boy, and he's traumatized. And why can't a community and the FCC say, no, violence in football is fine, but the breast is not okay.
And
that is obscene. But maybe a community or regulators can make that distinction.
And was it 1/20th of one
Yeah,
second until the parents?
But 11-year-olds pick things up quick. Floyd really wanted to see the breast.
Right. No, see, I think there's a hard question at least in there. I don't think you should do it by community. I mean, it seems to me once we have a definition of what's obscene, it has to be national in scope. That there's room for a level of community
Or maybe
activity.
international on the internet.
But maybe. But the harder question for me is, let's forget Wasilla now. Should America be able to make the decision? Should the FCC be able to make the decision for the country at large in the service of protecting our children from, or the parents being upset by their children watching it on regular television of a sort which is more restrictive than the First Amendment would allow in this room or in a nightclub or on the street or almost anywhere else. There, I think.
One flip of the dial on cable TV.
Yes.
By the way, just if the Super Bowl Floyd had appeared on ESPN and not on ABC, would the breast have violated anything?
Well, the FCC is moving towards saying cable is the same, even though the whole justification for treating broadcast television differently was more people want to watch than there are licenses, and there's a limitation on the spectrum. At least those were the old justifications. I'm not very optimistic at all that the Supreme Court, at least this Supreme Court, as it is today, will limit, and the Fox case is, I think, easier than a lot of others they may have. The Fox case is the one they're about to hear argued. But I'm not at all comfortable with the notion that the court will say, well, cable is different, and therefore we will not allow restrictions on cable as opposed to paid cable. And paid cable, I think they will leave alone. But ESPN is generally available.
Right.
It's certainly available without paying more if you have a set that gets cable. And an interesting question, it's a law school question, but it's really one for the country at large, is does it make sense to treat these different sort of entities different legally to the point that things can be shown on one and not the other? And if the answer is no, then the question is, well, which way will we go? Will we say it can never be shown on anything? Or will we say it can be shown on everything?
May I, in addition to the disparity in how different media are treated, which you couldn't tell by reading that plain language of the First Amendment, there's also a disparity in terms of the content of expression. And certainly this Supreme Court, including, I think, Floyd, you would agree, the current court, including some, across the political ideological spectrum on the court, are very protective of other kinds of controversial speech, including the racist kind of expression and defamatory expression, other politically controversial expression, blasphemy. I don't think anybody would try to criminalize that. But we have always, in this culture, treated anything to do with sexuality as suspect. And that is why the obscenity law, and that's why they had to ask the question of Lenny Bruce in one of the courtroom scenes, or of the witnesses, officer, were you turned on when you heard it? And you heard that word that my students and I are always stumbling over, the prurient interest, basically means, does it turn you on? Because if it doesn't do that, it doesn't come under the obscenity law. And that's why the FCC has had to create this fiction that the F word always has to do with sexuality. Because somehow our culture assumes if it is sexual, if it does turn you on, that's a danger that the government is allowed to protect us all against.
When Nadine and I were having a few drinks with Justice Scalia, I still remember.
And you only got the drinks because of my negotiation.
That's
Let us
right.
not forget that.
Where he said, I'm not a bad guy about the First Amendment. And Nadine said, citing a case about topless dancing, which the Supreme Court, by a 5-4 vote, had said could be banned, topless dancing, in a place that serves alcohol. She said, what about that case? And Scalia turned to me, I must say, man to man, and said, Floyd, topless dancing. Now, that's the First Amendment? That's what it's really all about?
Well, maybe he's got a point.
Yeah, but some people would say cross burning? That's what it's about, if you defended that, or flag burning.
Well, but
right?
that raises an interesting question. I mean, this is what you started saying a moment ago, Nadine, is true. With the exception of the sexuality and obscenity questions, liberals and conservatives are united in support of the principle of free speech, right?
Well, they say so.
I mean, it just seems that, is this, can we...
I just wrote something recently saying we have 3 Supreme Courts now on free speech issues. We have 4, I'm oversimplifying, more liberal members of the court who are very pro-free speech with respect to sexuality, but not at all about protests outside abortion clinics,
Right.
and not at all about money being spent
And if you
on
count
election
Breyer, if you
campaigns.
count Breyer as one of the liberals, he's
Yeah.
bad on these issues as well.
Yes,
We
yes.
lost his vote on
And then you have 4 more conservative members of the court who are very protective of speech, well, to take the 2 examples I cited, but protests, particularly around abortion clinics, contributions to political campaigns, which is a sort of a separate issue, but steeped in First Amendment. And you have Justice Kennedy, who in my view stands alone as the defender of the First Amendment on the Supreme Court in all these cases now.
Except students talking about drugs.
Yeah, but even students talking about drugs, he joined Justice Alito saying, we won't go any farther than this. But that's as far as, I mean, I think it's a fair way to say, I agree with you that while on the one hand, lawyer talk, on the one hand, yes, everyone on the court says they love the First Amendment. As in that great parody on Saturday Night Live a few weeks ago of Joe Biden, I take a bullet. Yeah, I mean, there's no one that doesn't start out saying, no one loves the First Amendment more than I do.
Yeah.
It's just after the word but
Yeah.
that follows it.
Yeah.
You have to listen very carefully. And one of the things I find distressing about the Supreme Court treatment is the ease with which members of the court on different sides throw out very serious First Amendment interests, throw away, overcome very serious First Amendment interests, as if they just don't matter because they don't fit with their view as to what really matters.
I have to say that I completely agree with Floyd, but I would make that generalization, present company accepted, about everybody, right? The ACLU has, I think, our most notorious case to this day goes back actually to the era when this film was made in the late 1970s, when we came to the defense of neo-Nazis in Skokie, Illinois, to wear swastikas. Skokie, Illinois is a town that had a lot of Holocaust survivors, as well as, you know, other Jewish members of the community. And ACLU members, diehard free speech absolutists, resigned over the country. We lost about 15% of our membership. People saying, I really believe in free speech, but, and now I want to quote one of my friends, a woman who died a number of years ago, who was the executive director of the National Coalition Against Censorship, Leanne Katz. And she said, everyone has his or her Skokie. That's just one exception of the one idea that you consider the most offensive, the most dangerous, that you're willing to sacrifice free speech to. And I think the point that Floyd is making is, if you add up all of those just one exceptions, whether it be violence, a lot of liberals were really after violence in the media, or, you know.
Can you imagine what will happen if Obama becomes president and we have an FCC dominated then by more liberal members? Mm-hmm. They're going to be tougher on speech, mm-hmm. at least on violent speech, mm-hmm. right?
And nooses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, because we learned recently, right, that among the hate speech categories, a noose wasn't considered yet a symbol that would have been protected.
Yeah.
And one could imagine, well, why not? Why not a noose? Why is a burned cross an indication mm-hmm. But remember, the professor at Columbia who received a noose, exactly. And that was part of the problem. So, well, if you could have a burned cross, why not a noose? Now, two things. One is the film sends a very strong message, whether you buy into the presumptions or not, that Lenny was actually, there were many ideas within the obscenity,
yes.
Right? He said important things.
Yes.
Even his nigger bit, right?
Oh,
that was supposed to be an important thing. What was his bit about homosexuality, right? He said,
yeah.
You know, they lived 15 miles away and they were the best teachers, mm-hmm. right? The best teachers happened to lift it, and yet they're the crime they committed. What if he had no ideas? What if what he said was just nonsense? He just said the words for no purpose, no context, no attempt to present an idea. You'd still protect it.
I still would, but actually that was the theory that the prosecution tried to use, and with some degree of success, precisely because this is one of the elements of the requirement for something to be obscene and therefore not protected under the First Amendment, is that it has to lack serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value, and you have to take the work as a whole. And the prosecution's view was that there was no whole. It's a comic bit. You know, you go from one series of observations to another, and they said the only connecting thread are all of these, quote, dirty words, and therefore there was no whole there. I would say, look, let's start, I'll be a conservative textualist. We start with the presumption of protection for speech. The burden of proof is on the government, and it's an appropriately very heavy burden of proof to show that unless we censor this expression, it's going to cause some enormous danger that cannot be averted in some other way.
What about hurt feelings?
And especially, we're talking about comedy clubs. Let's remember that. We have big problems now in the media, you know, and the rationale is that the television assaults you and you can't protect yourself against it. You have to be an adult to go into these clubs. Nobody's forcing you to go in there. I think you know what you're getting when, you know, you see Lenny Bruce on the bill.
That's true. But, you know, let's go back to your Skokie case, because that was, for many people, a galvanizing decision. People who read the opinion, there's, for me, a shocking moment where the Seventh Circuit says in the Skokie case, that there's no evidence in the record that the Holocaust survivors would have gone out onto the streets with baseball bats and sticks and beaten up the neo-Nazis. And had there been evidence of that, we could find some reason for the general welfare to prevent that kind of violence. But short of the survivors willing, they weren't even called survivors in those days, they were just refugees, right? This is a new term of art. But short of that, what we say to them is stay home. Don't go outside on that day. In that situation, I think what strikes people is, why are we privileging the rights of Nazis to walk, and we tell people who can be traumatized by their purported ideas to sit home and close the blinds and shut your ears and pretend it's not happening?
I certainly would never say that. In fact, in the ACLU's policy on defending the rights of extremist groups, we always talk about exercising. I mean, you have the option to stay home, and that's obviously your choice. But what about counter-speech? What about going out there and not using baseball bats, but having your own signs, having your own chants, and different people can react differently in terms of what they consider to be empowering, what they consider to be the least bad option. But may I also say something else? I mean, if these ideas exist in our society, I speak as the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, I want to know it. I don't want it to be squelched underground. And I think if you look at, we're getting pretty far afield from the topic here, but if you look at the societies that have enforced hate speech codes and repress the ideas, repress the expression of the ideas, it doesn't repress the ideas themselves. It doesn't end in eliminating discrimination based on religion, race, and so forth. It doesn't end in eliminating violence. In fact, one can argue that it erupts in a more virulent form, as we saw in the former Soviet Union. And
I just add that nothing has been a better tool for neo-Nazis than the internet. It has revived, expanded. I mean, all the benefits of the internet from a broad First Amendment perspective. Cheap to the point of not having to spend anything, available, unlimited, and unrestrained generally by law, although it's more restrained than a lot of people know. And yet, the price we pay for it is a haven for pornographers, including child pornographers, and Nazi groups. We, in this country, we send Nazi propaganda out around the world because most of the world bans it. Now, I'm with Nadine about opposing banning it, but there's a price tag on that. And it just seems to me important that we recognize that in this area of American exceptionalism, where we alone amongst democratic countries allow speech of this sort, and I will say parenthetically, I disapprove completely of the notion that the law should be differently if the survivors would come out with baseball bats to attack the Nazis. We choose to allow, we read our First Amendment to allow speech like this and to bar the government from interfering with it. And I think that is correct. And I think we profit as a society, both in even this area, but more broadly, with the general proposition that we don't let the government make these decisions about content, even including Nazis, but that we have to recognize that there is a price for that. And the price is that we become the homeland for the most venal speech in the world, spreading throughout the world.
May I make 2 points about Lenny Bruce before I forget? For those who are interested in learning more about the legal issues, this is a book that was done by 2 friends of ours, Ron Collins and David Scover. There had been a lot of writing about Bruce in general, but not about the trials. It's absolutely brilliantly written. It comes with a DVD that's got a lot of recordings of Bruce himself and some current comics who comment. I actually, one of the people on the ACLU National Board is, can you get this combination? She is a death penalty defense lawyer and a stand-up comic. And she was so thrilled when she heard I was doing this. And she said, well, Lenny, that's where it all started. He was the first comic that used comedy for social commentary. And I said, really? The very first? And she thought for a minute. She said, well, Shakespeare, which I thought was interesting. The second point I wanted to make was that Lenny Bruce, even though he was convicted, even under the law at the time, those convictions should have been, they were contrary to the law, and I think his lawyers were right that if he had gone through appeals, that the convictions should have been overturned. And in fact, although he didn't perfect his appeal in New York, technical term, his co-defendant, the club owner, did appeal, and sadly, 18 months after Lenny died of an overdose, the New York appellate court did overturn the conviction. Floyd Abrams was part of a distinguished team of lawyers that successfully petitioned then Governor George Pataki to issue the first ever of Lenny Bruce in 2003, and it was spearheaded by the guys who wrote this book. And it was apparently the first ever posthumous pardon for a First Amendment type violation all over the
Well done,
country.
Floyd.
Yeah.
Let's have some questions from the audience. Yes, sir.
Is there any provision in the law that he could be posthumously, conviction could be reversed?
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Is there any provision in the law that his conviction can posthumously be?
Yes, yes,
Reversed.
and that's exactly what happened in his
That's what
case.
that was. That's what that
And in fact, it's now been done subsequently for people who were convicted during World War I under, you know, the Espionage Act in Montana are also being posthumously, better late than never, right?
Yeah. I mean, there are certain symbolic acts, and obviously for Lenny Bruce, it's symbolic, but which do have more impact than others. And I think this one sends a good message, as does the other pardon that you mentioned, Nadine, of essentially socialists who were convicted in a series of politicized and First Amendment violative prosecutions after World War I. I mean, if we're prepared to go so far as to have the governors or the president or whoever has the pardon power to pardon, it does make it, in my view, less likely that that will happen again.
Are you going to petition George W. Bush for some pardons before he?
I think he has one in mind.
Anyone else? Yes.
I'm particularly fascinated that comedy today is really based on the foundation of Lenny Bruce and Richard Pryor. I'm just curious to know what has happened with the Michael Richards case, because a year ago, I believe he used the same routine that Lenny Bruce did when he pointed out two niggers in the audience, and it just backfired. Is there anything going on?
I think it never became a case. I mean, his career has been wounded.
Decimated.
But you know, he wasn't prosecuted.
Okay.
And I think that's a good sign of the times.
And yet, though, the fact that he said it may have ruined his career, and so that he was subject to moral censure, but not legal censure. And so the question is, what good is that, Floyd? I mean,
well, wait a minute. I don't disapprove of moral censure. Do you?
Well, no, I want to hear that. That's an interesting. People might be interested in
I mean,
knowing the
one can have
distinction.
different views as to whether it should strip him of his career, but the idea that there was a public uproar, I think, is good. I mean, you know, we have a First Amendment right to disapprove of speech, as long as we don't call in the cops.
It's a very important point. I hope everyone heard. I just sort of gave him a layup to know that it's not necessarily true that two of America's leading lights in the area of the First Amendment morally approve of things that are said. They just simply legally would protect the rights of people to say it. That doesn't necessarily mean Floyd thinks that what Michael Richards said in that club was appropriate.
No, but that's easy. The harder one is whether all of us, I'm sure, think what he said was inappropriate. Is it inappropriate to criticize him publicly, to pass a public judgment on him, to in effect censure him throughout American society? I think the answer is yes to that. Nadine?
Yeah,
Did you
I-
make
you
these
know-
distinctions
Oh,
between?
oh, no.
By the way, on the First Amendment.
Yeah, I was gonna.
No.
I actually think I was gonna bet
No.
that Nadine's gonna say
No.
if there's no legal censure, there shouldn't be moral censure.
Oh, no, absolutely not. In fact, I, many years ago, wrote an article that said censure, not censor, because censure is your exercise of your own free speech rights. And that's what I said. You know, the ACLU is always very strongly, in fact, we believe that we have a moral duty as civil libertarians to distance ourselves from the message, even though we're an anti-civil liberties message, because we're on the forefront of defending racial equality. We're on the forefront of defending reproductive freedom. So we're going to say, yeah, you have the right to have those anti-abortion protests. And, you know, that was one thing that you and Nino and I agreed on was, you know, that abortion protest case. But we're going to be out there, you know, counter-demonstrating in favor of reproductive freedom. What the hard question that was going through my mind as Floyd was talking was if you ratchet it up a notch more and you're talking about advertisers that are deciding to pull the plug so that the show can't get shown at all. What happened to Bill Maher
Actually,
after
a boycott.
9/11? Or a boycott was the other example where you're using economic pressure.
Very powerful
that-
moral
yeah.
censure.
Yeah.
You know, speaking back to Skokie, I keep coming back, but you know, the ACLU that defended the neo-Nazis, I think this is correct, most of those lawyers was a team of Jewish lawyers. That seemed repugnant to a lot of people, right? How could Jews be representing the neo-Nazis? But it wasn't true, I suspect, that the Jewish lawyers actually liked the neo-Nazis, right? I mean, it wasn't like they went and had beers together. They simply were arguing on behalf of their First Amendment rights to march in Skokie. Yes?
I wanted to know the rationale on the part of the powers that be, the government, who arrested Lenny Bruce for saying certain things, but naked ladies, or almost naked, strippers, very sexy,
interesting?
were allowed to just proceed unharmed.
I thought that was a very interesting juxtaposition. The other interesting juxtaposition I saw in the movie was Lenny Bruce's use of racial epithets in at least an attempt to defuse the stigmatizing nature. Maybe he didn't succeed, but that was his intent, as opposed to that popular Catskills comic that does this completely racist imitation of a Japanese person, and that was not considered offensive. So I think it was not the words in isolation or even the sexuality in its context. I think it had to have to do with the political message and the subversive context. You know, guys going to strip clubs, you know, guys will be guys. They weren't threatening society and culture as we knew it.
I'm afraid this evening's going to have to come to an end. It could have gone on for another hour. But we're definitely going to applaud, for sure. But let me give you some closing announcements. First of all, the film festival continues tomorrow at 6 o'clock here in McNally Amphitheater with The Paper Chase. And the post-screening conversation will be led by John J. Osborne, the author of the novel The Paper Chase, and Paul Bergman, who's a professor at UCLA, who's written a book called Real Justice. It's about the relationship between law and film. And then, of course, we're dark on Monday. We come back on Tuesday with seats still available for the rest of the film festival. It's www.fordhamfilmfestival.org. We want to thank, of course, our executive producer, Helen Herman, for whom all of this. And also, remember, after this, both Nadine and Floyd are available to sign books outside. All of their books are available, so it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. They're both here. You can get many copies of their books. Also, you know, the Hallwigs are here. Bob, I don't know if I know your wife, but they are one of our gracious sponsors for the Forum on Law, Culture, and Society. So it's important to acknowledge. And if anyone is interested in taking a cue from the Hallwigs, you can talk to our executive producer, Helen Herman. So I will see you tomorrow. I want to thank our gracious and dignified friends, Floyd Abrams, Nadine Soxton. Thank you so much. Thank you, Nadine. Thank you, Floyd. Thank you all for coming. We'll see you tomorrow.